Let's continue with our study. We're going to the number 5 in our study on the book of Esther, and God's got these truths on God's sovereignty from the book of Esther, and this tonight is the favor of God is what we're going to be speaking on. And when you look in the Bible, we can see several individuals that have made decisions that changed the course of history. We obviously know when Adam and Eve partook of the fruit that God to take, it changed and altered the course of history. Noah, when he built the ark, it changed things. Abraham, when he had the child by Hagar, it changed things. Moses, when he obeyed God and delivered Israel out of bondage, that was a huge thing that changed the course of history. And then when David, when he obeyed his father, and then when he killed the giant, that obviously was a huge thing and a big part of history. But as we've mentioned throughout this study, this is an important part of this story as we see that Esther being obedient to what God has called upon her to do. Now, one thing that we've made mention of, and this is something to take notice of once again, is that this book doesn't mention God by name. But we have mentioned that God is very evident throughout this story. And one quote has said that God has His finger upon everything that happens within this drama, this story that takes place here. So tonight, let's begin and let's go back into and catch up where that we left off with our last study. And number 1, this is Esther's petition of the king. Now, remember last time that Mordecai had talked to Esther and he had asked her a big thing. He had told Esther that she needed to go before the king. And this was huge because this wasn't some easy task. This wasn't something that could just be done very easily. To go before the king unannounced was pretty much a death sentence for any individual that would do that. And when Mordecai asked Esther to talk to the king, she hadn't been summoned in the past 30 days. So that's literally in our time, that's a month. And from a human's perspective, her life was at the king's mercy for her to go and do this deed. Now, a couple things here about Esther's petition of the king is that it was a prayerful decision that she embarked on to go do this. Now, when Esther received the message from Mordecai to approach the king, Esther requested all the Jews in Shushan and her maidens join her in fasting and prayer for 3 days. Listen to what this says again. They revisit this in Esther 4, verse 16 and 17. Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so I will go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Now, nothing is recorded within the text of what happened during those 3 days. Those 3 days that she calls on the people to pray. But there's no doubt in my mind that this was a sober, solemn time of seeking God's favor. This is very obvious. Why would they pray? Why would they fast? They're seeking wisdom from above. And I think that's very important for us also to realize is that when something huge is going on in our life, we need to bathe it in prayer. We need to saturate it in prayer. And this doesn't mean that you say just a little short prayer and then you're going to get your answer. No, I'm talking about being found upon your knees, praying, asking God for wisdom in what to do in a specific situation. And I believe that during this time that she asked all of these Jews and everybody, her maidens, to take place in praying, she asked them to be with her, join with her in praying about this specific situation. Now, only God could give Esther the favor she needed from the king when she would approach him unsummoned. Now, we go back to another situation, and we've touched on this a little bit before with Daniel. There is a time in the life of Daniel when he and his friends earnestly sought God's favor through prayer. Now, in this instance, Daniel had just learned that King Nebuchadnezzar, when I was younger, I couldn't say Nebuchadnezzar, so I just called him King Neb. But oftentimes you build little nicknames from people and you can't pronounce their names. But Daniel had just learned that King Nebuchadnezzar was killing all the wise men in the kingdom because they could not relate to him the dream that he had or interpret it for him. So Daniel went to his friends, and together they turned to God in prayer. Now listen to this text here, starting in Daniel 2:17. Then Daniel went to the house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are His. And He changeth the time and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth above kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knoweth to them that know understanding. So in this situation, we see something obvious as well, as God shows His favor there. And prayer is the key to move the heart of God. And often, times of difficulty that go on in our life are the catalysts God uses to draw us to Him in prayer. Now, prayer is something we talk about a lot, and I believe one day when we stand before a righteous, holy God, and we stand and we give an account of our life, I think one of the things that we will be the most ashamed of will be how little we used prayer and how much we could have used it, but we didn't. We need to be a people that's found in prayer. Prayer to us as Christians should be just as essential as the air that we breathe, because that's our communication with a holy God. That's how we commune. That's how we go to Him and share with Him our desires. And prayer is the key to move the heart of God. You want to see a great moving of God? You have people on their knees that are earnestly seeking God's direction. And when you have people on their knees doing that, amazing things can take place. And oftentimes, God can use difficult catalysts, these difficult situations, to draw us to Him in prayer. Now, if you want to see someone really pray, get them in the middle of a situation that they see that's difficult and hard. You'll see people pray. I heard Pastor say this years ago. He said, want to see where people pray the most? Go to the hospitals. Go to the hospitals where they have a loved one that's on the brink of death. Go to the hospital where they have someone that has gotten some very difficult news to swallow. That's where you'll see people that are praying there. D.L. Moody once said this, some people think God does not like to be troubled with our constant coming and asking. The way to trouble is not to come at all. Also, there's a quote that's unknown. I don't know who actually said this. It said, if Christians spent as much time praying as grumbling, they would soon have nothing to grumble about. Isn't that interesting? So we first here see the prayerful situation here of Esther as she's going to petition the king. And then we see here the differential. After 3 days of prayer and fasting, Esther used great wisdom and deference in her uninvited appearance before the king. Now, some things that you got to really pay close attention to is how she used this wisdom. And I believe that during these 3 days, she prayed, and in God's providential plan and in His sovereign wisdom, He gave her what she needed to get this done. And so we see this happening here. First of all, let's look at the royal dress. Now, knowing the capriciousness of King Ahasuerus, Esther dressed in a way that showed honor to his position. I believe that she dressed in a royal dress. It was something to behold. She was a beautiful Jewish young woman, and she dressed to come before the king. Look what it says here in Esther 5:1. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. Now, her garment more than likely would have consisted of purple and gold, showcasing her royalty and also reflecting the honor of the king. Now, very important to recognize here, she didn't just walk in with just something on, just to walk in just casually. But no, she knew she needed to honor the king because of his position, and that's what we see here when she comes before him. Warren Wiersbe said this: Esther was concerned whether the king would acknowledge her presence and grant her an audience. If he didn't, it would mean her immediate execution, and she knew how unpredictable were his moods. So this was something that God had revealed unto her and showed her and given her this wisdom to say, hey, go before him and honor him. Honor him with what you wear, because it's very obvious this guy was not stable. He listened to Haman. Obviously, we know the reason why is because when he went to the Greeks and he fought, he had a miserable defeat. And with that, he had a lot of money that he lost. And Haman came to him and flashed the almighty dollar. We're not really like the dollars that we see. But he flashed the money in front of him and said, hey, listen, if you'll do this, I'll give you this. And many commentators believe that, like I mentioned last week, that's the reason why that King Xerxes listened to Haman and was able to be deceived by Haman. Now, Warren Wiersbe said this: Esther prepared herself to meet the king. If you know you were going to meet the President of the United States at the White House, you would prepare for the meeting. You wouldn't just walk in with shorts and t-shirt on to go before a leader of a country. Now, if you were just going to go hang out or going somewhere else, hey, that's fine. But if you're going to meet someone that means a lot and it's a really prestigious event, hey, I'm going to go with my best on, aren't you? Or I'm going to try to. I'm going to kind of go and look my best. And this is what Esther's doing. She's going before the most powerful man that the world knew at that time in the Persian Empire. And she knew she had to dress with royalty. But also, not only that, she came with a calm demeanor. She remained calm in spite of her dire situation. Now, here's a question before we go to this verse. How do you remain calm in the midst of knowing that the time is ticking, that your people are on the brink of annihilation, the Jewish people? But she remained calm. Now, you know what many of us do when we know something is imminent and it looks like it's bleak and it's not looking good? Are we calm or do we panic? Now, sort of like that, there's a button on the side, hit the panic button. They're standing, the panic button, hit it, hit it, hit it. But oftentimes we get so wrapped up in what is going on that we will lose that calmness about ourselves and we get quite impatient. Look back at verse 1 again. Oh, it's okay. It's all right. I can read it. Oh, there we go. And it came to pass on the royal third, Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. Now, more important than her physical appearance was her inner preparation. I think during these 3 days, she asked God, a holy God. She prayed, she fasted. She said, God, now this is Jason here speculating, okay? There's a lot goes on in 3 days. But I could almost imagine that she's asking God to give her that calmness to go before the king and to say what needs to be said. And how does that happen? It can only happen with inner preparation. Now, I've spoken on this and I've preached a sermon on it before, that when we come to worship on Sunday mornings, there has to be an inner preparation before we come. I mean, oftentimes we get here and we've gotten here and we're just so excited that we even made it here, and we've rushed and we haven't prepared, we haven't prayed, we haven't read the Word through the week. We just come here and then we leave. But there should be a preparation on our behalf to come before and worship the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We should be prayed up, we should be ready to receive, and we should be ready to praise Him. And that takes preparation. And here is where we see within those days, she was inner prepared to go before the king. Now, 4 reasons, let's look at 4 reasons Esther could be calm in the face of danger. First of all, the Jews had been fasting and praying for 3 days, asking God to intervene and save them from annihilation. I believe that when she called on the Jews to pray, when she called upon her maidens to pray, she knew something would happen. She knew that there would be something that would happen because of the God that they worshiped. Number 2, Esther knew that God had covenanted with the Jews to deal with their enemies. This is Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in the name thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. It is almost without a shadow of a doubt that she would have heard this, she would have known this, and she would have believed this. And so Esther knew that God had covenanted and He had promised that He would do with the Jews and He would deal with their enemies. But also, thirdly, Esther knew that the God of Israel was a forgiving God who would hear His people when they humbled themselves and prayed. Verse that we've heard of often, 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people which are called by thy name shall humble themselves and pray and seek thy face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Oftentimes people use that as a jump start for revival. And obviously, if we would do that, we would see great revival. And so she knew this. Also, fourthly, Esther saw God's favor in that He had already allowed a remnant of Jews to return to their land and rebuild the temple. Now, like I asked and was talking about earlier, have you ever found yourself lacking composure in moments of stress or urgency? I know I have. Like I said, there's the panic button. Every time something happens, just hit the panic button. Philippians 4, 6 through 7, Paul knew a lot about this. Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known unto God. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Paul knew a lot about this. He knew a lot about stress. And I believe that this was him saying, there's a lot of difficult things, but the peace that is given by God passes all understanding, and it will help you through. Warren Wiersbe said this, one of the greatest needs in the church today is for intercessors who will pray faithfully for a lost world and for a church that desperately needs revival. So we see that there was a calm demeanor. So there's a differential, and then also let's look at the favored part of this. So here we see that she has come before the king. All this has taken place. So when the king saw Esther, she immediately had the king's favor. Look at what verse number 2 says. And it was so when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter, because they could not come before unless he had raised or he had held out the scepter there. He saw her as graceful, elegant, and this kind of favor was through the Lord's intervention. This is all that it could be. God was working behind the scenes. Remember we talked about that, working behind the scenes of this whole story, and we see this here in this text. And then look at verse number 3. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom. Interesting. This guy who is very just sporadic, that you don't really know who you're going to get. And then her walking in, and this happens. God's not mentioned in this whole entire book, but His finger is on this situation. It is very obvious. So first of all, we saw God's petition of the king, and then let's look here secondly at Esther's plot regarding Haman. Now the king made a kind gesture toward Esther. Esther responded with another kind gesture in return. An invitation for the king and Haman to a banquet. Now Esther requests Haman to the banquet. Look what it says here in verse number 4. And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. Now, most likely, it was during those 3 days of fasting, like we mentioned, that this plan was given unto Esther to complete the mission. I believe it was revealed unto her. God spoke to her and revealed what needed to happen here. Now, inviting Haman to the banquet was wise, very wise. And this is what's so important here within the context of this story, is because getting invited to this meeting did one thing to Haman. It boosted that pride. It was sort of like if his pride was a jar, it was overfilling, because this was just the pinnacle moment. He was going to be able to be in this meeting. And also, this would have led him to be less suspicious of Esther's intentions of what's going on here within this story. But also increased Esther's favor in the eyes of the king because of the trust he had in Haman. So, very wise. I've often said that when you're dealing in situations, we ought to pray for wisdom. You act quick, you're more likely to make mistakes. But if you've got a big dilemma, a big decision to make, pray about it. God will reveal to you. He'll show you Scripture. He'll reveal unto you to where you'll feel this is what needs to happen, so you don't make those errors, those mistakes that can happen when you act very promptly. But also we see here Esther requests a second banquet. Now Esther didn't inform the king about Haman's plot in the first banquet. This was due to it not being the best time or place, more than likely. If others were present, or if they were serving in the palace, it would have been against court etiquette for the queen to make this public plea. It would have been just all these people around, and she would have said, listen, this is what Haman's going to do. It just would not have been the right context to do that. And once again, I believe within those 3 days, that mission was given by God to her of what needed to happen. So instead, Esther made the king comfortable and requested a second banquet, this time exclusively with Haman and the king. Look what it says here in verses 5 through 8. Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition? And shall it be granted thee? And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Then answered Esther and said, My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if I please the king to grant thy petition to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king hath said. So, this banquet included just the king, Haman, and Esther. But what happens here? Haman's pride continues to increase. Continues. Warren Wiersbe said this, what an honor for Haman to attend a special banquet with the king and queen alone and in the queen's private apartment at that. It's unlikely that any official in the empire had ever been so honored. As Haman ate and drank with Ahasuerus and Esther, his confidence grew. He thought of himself. He maybe was starting to think, maybe I can become better than the king. I mean, this guy was literally in that position of being so prideful that he thought that he was just the stuff. You know how people used to say, that guy's just, or that girl's just got the stuff. And they know what's going on. They just have it about them. And that's what he thought about himself. He was a very sly, just deceiving individual. Now, leaving the banquet with a renewed sense of power and influence, Haman encountered the person who had challenged his pride more than anything else in the palace. He comes by him once again, Mordecai. And guess what happens when he walks by him? He gets more infuriated. He thinks, I don't like you. I despise you. He hated Mordecai. Haman saw Mordecai sitting at the king's gate once again, and Mordecai would not stand at Haman as he walked by. Look what it says in verse number 9. Then went Haman forth that day joyful with a glad heart. Oh, he was just walking, just saying, hey, guess what? I got invited to be with the king and the queen. He was probably just walking, just having a good old time. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, he probably thought, you scoundrel, you wouldn't even worship me. Now, you're not even going to get up. You wouldn't bow. Now you're not going to stand up nor move for him. He was full of indignation against Mordecai. The text tells us that he was full of that. The word indignation comes from the Hebrew word hema, which means heat, rage, hot displeasure, and a burning anger. Oh, you ever heard, you just made me so mad, I'm going to grit my teeth. You've heard somebody say that before. I've heard some teachers that have gotten mad at some students and they just wanted to grit their teeth about things that they were doing. But I could almost imagine Haman was just so joyful. And here we go. His joy goes to anger. He is mad at Mordecai. So Haman's emotions plunge from the pinnacle of elation to severe wrath, all because of pride. Now, just like Haman hated Mordecai because he was a Jew, there will be people who despise us because we're Christians. I've had people that have spoke ill of me just because I've stood with what the Word says. You probably have too. I've had people that have called me names, said that I'm crazy. How in the world can you believe this? This is outdated. That was written so long ago, and you're still believing what it says. And I said, yep. I said, the Bible is more relevant than tomorrow's newspaper. And so I just think that when we think of this, you're always going to have those people that despise you because of the stands that you take. And Haman hated Mordecai. Yes, because he was a Jew, but also because of what he was doing. Number 2, we see here that he brags to friends. So after walking past Mordecai and renewing his rage, Haman composed himself. Once again, he goes from, oh man, I'm such a wonderful person. Look what I'm going to be able to go do. I'm so mad. And now he composes himself and he has enough to return home and he brags to his friends about the banquet. You ever heard someone likes to brag? Hey, it's okay to brag on your kids, your grandkids, brag on something. You've heard people do that before. But listen to what he says here in verses 10 through 12. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself and he went home. He sent and called for his friends and Zeresh, his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches and multitudes of his children and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and now he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman said, moreover, Yea, Esther the queen did not let no man come in the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself, and tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. Now, this pride exhibited many of the characteristics that God hates, and this is mentioned in Proverbs 6, 16 through 19. These 16 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among the brethren. With everything Haman had, you would think he'd be satisfied. Remember? Look what he gave to the king. You would think this guy would be happy. However, people like this that think they have it all are oftentimes never content. Just look at movie stars. Think about people that have mansions. They're never content. I preached on this once before. Paul spoke about being content. How do we be content? Not content with where your walk is with the Lord. That's not what we're talking about. But being content with having Jesus, and that's all we need. And I think that's very obvious here that he was never satisfied. William Barclay said this, pride is the ground in which all the other sins grow, and the parent from which all the other sins come. So pride is huge here. Reminded of a story of a 5-year-old who came home from kindergarten beaming with pride. Oh, he was just smiling. You couldn't take that smile off his face. After 2 weeks of school, he proclaimed to his grandmother that he was the smartest kid in the class. He was the smartest. No one could touch him. His grandmother beamed. Is that what the teacher told you, that you were the smartest student in the class? He said, no, ma'am, the boy replied. I had to tell her that I was the smartest kid in the class. But Haman had no problem telling others how great he was. See, we shouldn't be walking around telling people how good that we are. I mean, there are people that are very talented at what they do. We should never be bragging about what we've done, but we should be bragging on what He has done. We should brag about the Lord all the time, telling about His goodness, telling about His grace, His mercy. That's what we should be doing. Number 3, he plans to kill Mordecai. Now, the only way in Haman's mind to be satisfied was to eliminate the one person hurting his pride. So Haman began dealing exactly how he intended to kill Mordecai. He started to strategize. How am I going to take this guy out? Look what it says here in verse 13 and 14. Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then said Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends with him, Let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and morrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Now, Haman could not wait until all the Jews died. So he plotted to end Mordecai's life quick. Now, he wanted all the Jews dead. But he was so mad at Mordecai, he said, I tell you what, Mordecai, I'm taking you out before I even start the process of annihilation of all the Jews. But also, not only that, he wanted to make Mordecai a public spectacle. He wanted to humiliate him in front of everybody. So he had fallows 50 cubits high made for Mordecai. Warren Wiersbe said this, not one to waste time, Haman ordered that the gallows be made. Now, we're not sure whether the gallows itself were 70 feet high or whether it was put in a prominent place that lifted it to that height. such as the city wall or roof or a building. We're not for sure. He's right about that. But we do know that it would have been a public spectacle. People would have seen it, and he wanted people to know that Mordecai went against him, and he wanted him to die. Now, going back to chapter 1 with King Ahasuerus and Vashti, Queen Vashti, we see that anger led a person to make a hasty decision, like he did with the queen. It is very important. This is a lesson for us because I've had this happen in my own life, and I'm probably sure you have too. It's important to guard ourselves against allowing anger to take over in our emotions. Someone does us wrong, and in the moment or in the heat of our emotions, we let things overboil, and what happens is we make decisions and we say things that we wish we wouldn't have. We've all done that. And oftentimes you do it, and once you say something, you can never take it back. You can apologize all day, but once you've said it, there's no getting it back, and that's sad. Proverbs 14:29, he that is slow to the wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. Slow to wrath. I've always tried to be a person, and I'm far from perfect. I'm far from it. But I've always wanted to strive to be a person that is quick to listen and slow to speak, instead of being quick to speak and slow to listen. Because if you listen and you think before you say anything, you will make a better decision 100% of the time than you would just off the cuff saying something and getting yourself deeper in trouble. So something just always to remember. All right, let's look here lastly at God's plan for the people. Now we've seen the prayers and obedience of a young Jewish woman, but now we're going to see the power of that young woman's Almighty God. The king's sleeplessness. Now the night of Esther's first banquet, the king found himself unable to sleep. Oh, he couldn't sleep. Oh, he was just restless. So he requested for the book of records to be read to him. Now this is an interesting thought, because as you read this, what a thing to have read to you if you just stop right here. That would be like for not being able to sleep at night and you say, someone bring me the world book. Would you please read that to me? Maybe that'll help me with my sleep tonight. Or would someone just bring me an encyclopedia, just start reading to me just information? Or would someone bring to me the history of my family? Oh, I would just love to hear all those names and what's going on. It's sort of an odd thing when you hear that, but once again, God's working behind the scenes in this, so this is important. So, there is a book of records that is brought to him. And look what it says here in Esther 6, 1-3. On that night could not the king sleep? Oh, he couldn't sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, and two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servant that ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him. Now, the timing of the king's sleeplessness was impeccable. It was the very night that Haman was at home with his friends and plotting Mordecai's death. How does all that happen? God. It's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. It's God. And as the king listened to the chronicles read, he had the recounting of the incident in which his life was threatened. And remember Mordecai? He could have just walked on by. He didn't have to do anything. He could have been mad. He had a right to be mad at the king of Persia. But he did right. Not only was it his service duty, but also he just knew this was the right thing to do. And here he was reminded of the man who had uncovered and reported the assassination plot, Mordecai. The king then wondered how Mordecai was honored for this heroism. I mean, He saved my life. How was he rewarded? When he found nothing was done, the king determined at that moment that something had to be done for good old Mordecai. So Mordecai may have thought that God had not rewarded him for his good deed, but God sees every labor of love and will reward it. This is a clear, perfect example of thinking that when you do something for the Lord, it goes unnoticed. It doesn't. Now, something may not happen immediately, but one day God will reward us for our deeds in the flesh that we've done for Him. So something to keep in mind. Look what it says here in Hebrews 6:10. For God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love which you have showed toward His name, in that ye have ministered to the saints and do minister. Now, we just have a few more minutes here left. Let's look here at the king's inquiry. Now, by this time, it must have been the early morning hours. It may have been perhaps before dawn. Oh, the king, I'm telling you that after he got that book of Chronicles, we really know, but I bet once he read that, I don't know if he slept. He may have been excited about getting Mordecai and to honor him. I mean, we really don't know. But the king hears someone in the outer court and inquires who it is. It was Haman, who had come to seek the king's permission to have Mordecai hanged. Look what this says in Esther 6:4-9. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said unto him, behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to honor more than to myself? Oh, he probably is thinking like, oh, king, you shouldn't, who are you thinking of? And the king answered, and Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king used to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. Oh, this is a really great plan. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal, whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback throughout the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Haman's got a good idea. He's got a really good idea here. Do you think for a moment he's thinking, I'm going to be that person? But he's got a great plan, a great way to honor this individual. Then we see here Haman's assignment. Look at verses 10-11. Then the king said to Haman, make haste, and take the apparel and the horse as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew. Oh, you probably could have heard the crickets chirping, the dropping in the room. That sitteth at the king's gate, let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. The king essentially said to Haman, those are some great ideas, Haman. I don't think I could have come up with anything better myself. Go find Mordecai the Jew and do all that for him today. And then look here at verse 12-14. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house mourning and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men, and Zeresh his wife unto him, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains, and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. Now, we don't know a whole lot, except from this text, just a few places, about Zeresh, Haman's wife. We don't know what type of relationship they had. Maybe she was fed up with his pride. Who knows? I mean, we really don't know the context of that. We can only assume. But Haman's wife has some reservations, and that's very clear here through what we read. She warns him that he would not be able to prevail against Mordecai. That's what she's saying here. Soon Haman will be heading to that banquet that evening before he had been so boastful of. And it's hard not to wonder and just to speculate. I like to just think, like, what may have been going on? What were they thinking? It's hard not to wonder how the events of the morning affected him as he was summoned to the second banquet. Because Mordecai saved the king. The man that he wants dead is Mordecai, the one that saved the king. And now he has this decree and he's wanting to take him out. So how is he thinking? What's going through his head? Oh, I guarantee you, he probably was nervous. That's right. He was nervous. He said, I don't know what I'm going to do. How did all this happen? It's all because of God. God was working behind the scenes. I know I've said that a lot, but this book just shows how God was placing people, putting them in certain positions, and how He was working so that His people would still live. And that's what this whole story is about. So we'll stop there tonight as we continue on. But anything kind of caught your attention? We're kind of walking through a story just as you know. Obviously, if you've read the book, you'll know how things turn out. But it's interesting to walk through this and look at things specifically about seeing how God worked and how He did what He did in getting Esther to the position to where she was. I wonder how big that book of Chronicle was. Yeah. And to read about Mordecai. I mean, I'm sure there was probably a lot in there, but to read that specific part, it's God. I mean, there's no coincidence about it. It's God. He was showing and giving favor to Mordecai, the one who had spared the king's life, who had saved him. Maybe. That's right, yeah. Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. Well, boy, he slept good that night, though. I don't know if he slept good or if he stayed up all night. He was just excited, but I'm sure he was very thankful. I mean, that was a huge deal to save the king's life. And when he found that, he said, something's got to be done to honor him. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything else? Another thought? All right. Well, thank y'all for coming tonight, and hopefully this has been enjoyable as we walk through this. Very short book. I mean, we only have maybe 3-4 more studies left of this, and then we'll be done. But I thought it'd be neat to go through this, and what a powerful story here. All right, we'll stand to our feet and we'll pray. Arnie, you want to close us in prayer?